Well, hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Transmissions, a Class Unity podcast. My name is Nicholas Kiersey, and my co-host for this episode is Martin Thompson-Jones. And our guest for this interview is Alex Hochuli of the BungaCast podcast, which I know a lot of Class Unity members listen to. So Alex has recently published a piece on American Affairs Journal called Technofeudalism Versus Total Capitalism. And Martin and I were very taken with the title, and we read it together, and we were very fortunate to be able to get Alex to join us today for a chat about this very, very insightful and interesting article, very long article. Alex I know you can write short form, but this is not one of those pieces. You get into a lot of meat and potatoes here.
Too many words. Far too many words.
Far too many words, but it was great. So listen, first of all, want to get into your critique of the techno-feudal hypothesis. There's a lot of literature emerging in this area today, recent books by people like Yanis Varoufakis, Jodi Dean, to name just two. And as you argue, the feudalism rather in techno-feudalism is at least in part an argument that we are kind of witnessing a regression from the kinds of freedoms and maybe even the kinds of sort of political subjectivities that Marxists, for example, have counted on in their contributions to discussions about socialist strategy. So I know you have criticisms of all of this, but just to set the scene before we get into your perspectives on all of this, what exactly is the techno-feudal hypothesis, and how does it frame the present as this, as you say, regression from the key features of classical capitalism, whether that be in terms of market freedom or the agency of different types of classes, or even the possibilities of socialist transformation itself?
Yeah, so let me make a comment, I guess, first of all, and actually even before that, thank you for having me on, and thank you for the introduction. I'm looking forward to be able to discuss this with ever more people. I think because and I say that because that leads into what I'm about to say, which is that we're all conscious of a sense of crisis nowadays. This is no surprise to people, and it's not. You don't need to be talking to Marxists or be a Marxist yourself to hold to this. When we started the Alpha Bunga Bunga, we were talking about the end of history. We already had that notion from 2016 onwards. Then we started the podcast in 2017. Kind of ran with that already as the framework for what we were wanting to do. And at the time, the challenge was, and I think the task even that we set ourselves, was to explain to people that, look, all this stuff which is feeling like it's falling apart, there's a reason for this, and there's no going back. So there's no point in your hysteria, and there's no point in your nostalgia for a recent past which wasn't that good, right? And that the possibilities for politics today are greater, albeit limited, but greater than they were in the period of the 90s and 2000s, and that therefore we should, if not embrace, at least confront with equanimity this new era that we're entering into. That the end of history shouldn't be a thing that we look back on as a golden age. Interestingly, now the post-war golden age emerges ever more golden, I think, for a lot of people, and both on the left and the right. And I think this is important because for everybody other than the technocratic centrist, i.e. the ostrich coalition, the people sticking their heads in the sand still, despite everything, there's been a rewriting of what the golden age was. Because during the end of history, the post-war golden age was understood as a time of politics, of radicalism, of turbulence, maybe not so much the 1950s, but certainly the 1960s and 1970s, and perhaps something not to be returned to. Maybe some people thought it was cool, whatever. Stuff was looked at in a cultural lens and like, oh, there was this cool stuff going on in the 60s, maybe now it's not so cool, whatever. But basically, it was understood as a time of turbulence, of conflict, of tumult. And now, both left and right look at the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and maybe even into the 80s, as something, wow, there was stability, principally. There was peace. Mm-hmm. There was order. There was, progress. And obviously there's different left and right inflections to this and different points of emphasis. The right will maybe emphasize ethnic homogeneity, stable gender roles, etc. And then the left will talk more about unionization, about left-wing parties with some weight to them in some direction, etc. But nevertheless, there's a kind of rewriting going on. And I think that's important and testifies to the fact that the end of history is something that everybody's aware of now. I mean, they might understand it in these terms, and I'm not going to insist that they do or anything, but I think there's a deep consciousness of that it's not just kind of a momentary crisis, or even just widespread turbulence, but there's something deeper going on. So the eternal present of the end of history has been left behind for what we have now, which is a pretty acute sense of decay and decline. I mean, this is particularly marked in the US, in the UK, in France, probably in Germany, and certainly Germany will get there. Germany is a bit of a laggard in this whole story. So all of it, what does this have to do with techno-feudalism, right? What does it have to do? Well, because it's a way of depicting and describing decline. And in that regard, I think it's worth engaging with, and it's worth engaging with at least somewhat sympathetically or with open ears, because it's trying to deal with the same questions that we all are, right? And we all, I don't just mean kind of the Marxist left or something like that, but well beyond this, the post-liberal right trying to do it, radical centrist of kind of the non-technocratic variety are trying to do this, various shades of the radical right maybe as well trying to deal with it. In fact, consciousness of decline is an inherent quality to the right itself. I mean, or certainly has been of the right until the 1980s, perhaps, until neoliberalism gave them a new kind of forward thrust and sense that they were in the ascendancy. And there's a different kind of class coalition that emerges around that. But without going into all of that, the important thing that I want to say, just as a way of framing why I find technofeudalism interesting and worth engaging with, even if I'm very critical of it, is that there's not just a slump, there's not just global imbalances or low growth and all these matters, but even more orthodox economists will testify to what they call secular stagnation. Everybody talks about rising inequality, new forms of domination and unfreedom, the new tech sector, which isn't even a sector anymore, but is kind of its products, its services, its modes of operation have infiltrated all areas of the economy, things as distant as agriculture, which we think of as being very organic. I mean, no pun intended, because a lot of it is whatever, he uses fertilizers and whatever, so it's obviously not organic in that sense, but it's something related to the land, which seems very far away from all this digital stuff. But no, it's very intimately linked indeed. As Cory Doctorow testifies to in his work on enshittification and forms of monopoly and so on, you can't repair your tractor, your John Deere tractor, on your own anymore. You have to have specialized parts because there's IP associated even to the maintenance of it. So Cory Doctorow emphasized if you can't perform maintenance on your own stuff, you don't own it, right? It's rented, and all these forms of rent are increasingly present. I think I saw recently that Volkswagen is charging a subscription model to allow your car to exceed a certain speed, even though it's able to go faster. You have to unlock digitally this thing, which allows your car to go above whatever 120 kilometers an hour.
Wow, that's amazing.
So these things are the digitalization, I guess, is penetrating ever deeper into vast areas of not only just like social life, but the economy. So all this means that we should be at least open to discussions which try to go, look, something deep in the economy and the structure of society, right? Kind of a social totality is somehow changing. And this is what we're all doing. Now, the techno-feudal theorists, and you mentioned, Jodi Dean, Yanis Varoufakis, who's probably the most well-known advancer of this concept. It's worth noting that there are, the kind of conservative or old social democratic kind of thinker, geographer Joel Kotkin has been talking about neo-feudalism for, I think, longer than that. And my point is basically that descriptively, they're all talking about the same things that I am, that you guys are, that that are kind of, that people are, that we're all kind of concerned with, right? Of great geographic imbalances globally and nationally, new peripheries emerging, new forms of inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, geographic inequality, new forms of unfreedom, desocialization or social ungluing, however you want to talk about it, kind of deep forms of atomization, new forms of unfreedom, prison camps, setting up in various places, etc. So
right.
Obviously a very deep sense of disquiet, if not despair, about the direction of things. And so techno-feudalists, and I should mention Cédric Durand, the French theorist in this as well, who in my opinion presents the most serious engagement with these ideas. He's an advocate of techno-feudalism. Indeed, his book came out in French before Varoufakis' did, and it's for my money the one, probably the only one really worth reading, because he makes concessions and understands the certain weaknesses of the argument, unlike the others, which are like a little bit too like, this is literally feudalism, and I don't think that's that really isn't a case you can hold. But interestingly, all of these people are talking about time frames in which this has emerged, which is basically the last 5 to 30 years. So it's about neoliberalism, or it's about the period post-2008 crisis, or even past the post-2020 crisis. In Varoufakis' account, one of the reasons that techno-feudalism has emerged is that you have these mass deluges of money, which has created a new class of capitalists. So all this free money printed out to the 2008 crisis and 2020 crisis has allowed, which Robert Brenner has talked about as leading to political capitalism. This massive state-led upward redistribution of wealth. That this has formed a new class of capitalists who stand above the ordinary capitalists involved in production. Varoufakis calls these cloudalists. I mean, he's never shy of coining new terms, so that's a particularly
committed
ugly
to the bit
one.
there, yeah.
What's that?
He's committed to the bit.
He's committed to the bit, yeah. The cloudalists is ugly, and I don't think will stick. But in any case, he has tried to identify a new class rising as a central part of a new mode of accumulation, and not just a new mode of accumulation, new mode of production emerging, which he calls techno-feudalism. Interestingly, this is all Marxists, right? Basically saying something new is happening. They're talking about the bad and the new. We're all talking about the bad and the new. So this is important. But their understanding of it is to go against, I guess, tacit Marxist and general socialist precepts that what follows capitalism is socialism in some way, or barbarism. And they kind of go, well, it's not that, it's techno-feudalism. Okay, well, let's try to understand what that means. And then in a kind of more short-term, to bracket in a more short-term sense, and Cédric Durand is good on this, is that there's basically a transition from, the old Californian-style libertarianism, Silicon Valley ideology, from the 70s, 80s onwards, which very much seemed like an extension of social movements into the kind of capitalist economy, right? This is the famous Californian ideology being the famous confluence of 60s hippies and 80s yuppies, to something completely different, right? So it had its libertarian anti-state threads, and now it's a very clear state capital nexus. I mean, what is the latest one that I wasn't aware of this? Someone told me this, that some of the co-founders of Palantir have been actually awarded army rank or some military rank or something. So this is not Peter Thiel, I think, but Alex Karp, if I'm not mistaken, one of the co-founders of possibly the most frightening agency company out there, Palantir, being somehow given the keys to the state in some way. I can't forgive me for not remembering the exact details.
No, I was something like that in the news. Yeah.
Yeah. So things have very radically changed. I don't think it's technical to kind of summarize, like for this in response to, I've gone on too long for the first question, but to summarize it briefly, it's not techno-feudalism. It has nothing to do with feudalism. All that whole theoretical baggage is the wrong way to understand it. But on a descriptive level, all the things that they talk about is right. And there is definitely something new emerging.
Uh-huh.
Right? So I'm not arguing that there's no new, that, oh, it's still the same old capitalism somehow, and that nothing is different from the 1950s or the 1980s, right? But to understand it as feudalism is really misleading.
Mm-hmm. Martin, I know you were going to jump in there, I think, on some of the technical aspects of the argument.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it's great to have the chance to talk to you about this, Alex. And as Nick said, we both really liked the article, and indeed, I was kind of just worried I was going to struggle to come up with questions that weren't just like, "Yay, cheerleading, agreeing, here." It seems like and some of what you were just saying, I think, suggested sort of overlaps with what I was about to what I want to ask first, but it seems like the techno and neo-feudalists. I don't know so much about Kotkin, but based on your article, it seems like Durand, Varoufakis, Dean. A big part of the case they're trying to make that we're transitioning into something, or have transitioned into something that's at least analogous to feudalism, involves putting this emphasis on rent. That rent has become sort of predominant economically. At least as a form of accumulation, that sort of accumulation by the way of rents, perhaps along with more predation and plunder than in some recent previous past, has become central, as opposed to accumulation driven by commodity production from the good old days of industrial capitalism, right? But if that to the extent that that's one of the core claims or one of the core drivers of the argument, that rent has overtaken profit, or is on the way to overtaking profit, or has become so much more central, and this is a reason for thinking that we're moving away from capitalism and into something that deserves to be thought of through the lens of thinking about feudalism, then a question that I had was just, it seems like there's a lot of emphasis, perhaps most obviously for Varoufakis, although Durand has Silicon Valley in the title, right? A lot of emphasis on big tech, right? And there are, of course, other things going on in the economy that involve accumulation through what can be classed as rent, a word that's used in lots of different ways. But so I'm thinking of finance, essentially, right? So you've obviously got BlackRock, whose valuation, I can't remember how much money they're supposed to control now, but it's like $1 trillion or something, right? Or so you've got the asset managers and the private equity firms and gigantic insurance companies and so on. And this is less new, perhaps, than big tech, but it's also can be seen as a kind of increasingly large portion of the economy that's doing accumulation through rent. And so, is there a reason for putting, if indeed they are putting more emphasis on big tech, is there some special reason to put more emphasis on big tech than on these other actors? Would it make a difference to the account if you took these other actors into more? One thing I wondered is, you said, that for Varoufakis, it's partly about a mode of production, not just a mode of accumulation. So is that a difference, perhaps? But anyway, so.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, first of all, they have their differences in their account, and Varoufakis is the most reductive, or is the most willing to just slap a label on it to go, listen, if you're not interested in following all the details, it basically means profit over rent, rather the way around, rent over profit. Yeah. I think it is notable. I think it's right what you seize on. It's not that they only talk about the tech sector. I think they talk about rents as a whole. I perhaps in my article focused a little bit more on that, not least because that question of tech is where there is an intersection between the forms of income, right? So specifically rent, and the forms of domination and control exerted, which are through algorithmic behavior modification, et cetera, et cetera. Again, all features which are there, but I think what it means is where I have discordance with them. I think the financial. Interestingly, this is obviously forefront of my mind because it's what I read most recently. But Ilya Salami's excellent book on state capitalism, which we just interviewed him on BungaCast yesterday, and the episode's going to come out in a couple of weeks. And inevitably, these are the things that. But when he presents a very convincing and comprehensive account of kind of what the economy looks like and the interlinking between state and capital, there's various forms of I don't know whether to put it as like kind of an unproductive activity, or forms which are not do not speak to an idea of a dynamic competitive capitalism, right? But which aren't entirely reducible to rent, right? So, for example, financialization is not just companies speculating, but the use of finance as a means of like centralization and concentration of capital, right? Companies buying out all sorts of competitors around the world and entering into a global competition. There's industrial overcapacity, and all of these matters which lead to a crisis really of valorization globally, and and we shouldn't allow China's apparent dynamism and indeed genuine dynamism to distract from that being a reality as well. And there's various forms also then when we kind of drill down into rent, there's various forms of things which orthodox economists call rent, as I argue in the article, that they call rents like monopoly rents, IP rents, etc., which would normally be understood as super profits, right? You create something, you invent something new. It allows you to hoover up a larger share of value, which might be created elsewhere in the economy, and make a claim over that value, which makes you a lot richer and more powerful than other companies in other sectors. But that doesn't mean you're living off of rent. Now, that means that there are loads of types of kind of rentierism, sitting on assets and letting them accrue in value and charging people to use them, both with regard to land, which is where the notion of rent comes from. And I think it's something that I draw attention to. I don't think rent is only with regard to land, but that's these economic concepts coming from classical political economy are important to refer back to, because that's where they come from. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about them. That rent refers to land, which is it's not a produced means of production. It's just something that's there and doesn't automatically produce value on it, kind of on its own. It needs to be put to work. And it's that this applies in a way to kind of sitting on a bunch of data, or sitting on a bunch of other forms of assets which accrue in value. But I don't think that this is entirely the whole story of it, or rather that we can't just bundle it all up into rent. Yevgeny Morozov's article in the New Left Review from a couple of years back, which was actually the first kind of thoroughgoing critique of techno-feudalism that I read, but which came out before some of these books, though he refers to some of the same authors. He's someone who understands how I think the tech sector works. I mean, he's been a critic of these things for a long time. Makes the point that a lot of what we think as kind of useless tech stuff, and which doesn't really provide a lot of value to you as a consumer and doesn't really seem productive of a new commodity, actually is a commodity. You might think it's crap, but that's the story of a lot of capitalism, right? We capitalism produces weapons which destroy us all. That doesn't seem very useful to anyone, but it's nevertheless, you're still in commodity production. And the same goes for, as I think he gives an example, and I use it in my article, of Spotify. Like Spotify provides a new kind of curated music experience, which is an intangible commodity, and it might not be very productive of new value, but nevertheless, it's not a form of rent. The rent seekers in that whole operation are music labels who own the rights to music and charge you to play them, right? So there is a lot of rent seeking in the economy. It's behind a lot of kind of stagnation, but again, I think the way they analyze it, so that at a descriptive level, they're correct. At an analytical level, I think they misunderstand what these things are. And then as a consequence, at a systemic level, they mischaracterize it as feudalism.
Very good. All right. So I think one other aspect of this conversation that stands out to me, Alex, and I think it's, a lot of this, I think, is to do with the fact that Varoufakis and Dean, to an extent, are kind of quite unique writers. I think, as much as I may disagree, or we may disagree with them, they have a talent sometimes to kind of express something in a certain way that kind of grabs your attention, and they might start reducing a lot of things to that, but that doesn't mean it's not worth exploring. And I think you've kind of already made that point earlier on in your own words. But One of the ways I think that Varoufakis is interesting here is where he comes up with a certain line and he's trying to explain, how this mode of power works right today. And he'll say something like, well, with Don Draper, we had a chance, but not with Alexa, right? And so, in your piece, you're kind of summarizing the technofeudalist position as one essentially resting on the idea that power today is sort of distinct from the power of classical capitalism, which was sort of, maybe one guy chain smoking cigarettes and drinking bourbon in an office on Manhattan Avenue, an advertiser, in other words, to this much more kind of pernicious, algorithmic formulation that has an amazing capacity to sort of transcend the traditional agenda setting and propaganda power of the usual or typical capitalism to a new kind of, you use the phrase, I think, iron cage or algorithmic behavior modification power. So it's a bit of a mouthful, sorry, but on that basis, the techno-feudal theorists seem to be arguing that part of what they're trying to get at is this kind of fragmentation of sovereignty, which is something that they find in feudalism as well. Private powers governing their own little fiefdoms, this kind of thing, right? Without any necessarily sort of centralized binding authority over that. Of course, like there's questions of historical accuracy there, and I think you get into that a little bit. But how exactly? I know you said there's something here that they're talking about things that we ought to be taking seriously. Well, with these platforms or cloud-based actors, how does the argument work that these entities are taking on these quasi-sovereign functions?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I guess there's two elements to that question, which is a very good one. Like, one is the new means of control, behavior modification, and the second one is to do with sovereignty. So maybe taking them one by one. Firstly, I mean, Varoufakis, and I just opened up my notes here to remember the terms that he uses. Varoufakis goes furthest down the line of making this argument that behavior modification is somehow has taken a step change. Right. And I'm kind of a little bit sarcastic about that, going, hey, Vance Packard discovered the hidden persuaders back in the 1950s, which was a kind of a liberal centrist, back when liberal centrism meant something else, liberal centrist discovery of, too much power, back when liberals were actually genuinely liberal and were concerned with big concentrations of power.
Right.
And we're worried about advertisers and what that all meant. And of course, nowadays, advertising is everywhere. In fact, this is one thing which I was really mistaken on, and kind of I assumed that the crisis, this is a bit of tangent, but I assumed that the crisis of trust, which is affecting all institutions, right? And I've worked in a marketing and PR firm, a big one, in the research department, and so I kind of have seen a little bit from the inside what the thinking is there, that you basically need advocates. It's where like the influencers originally come from, not just people doing little dances on Instagram or showing their tits or whatever, but or selling far right ideas, but of people who might be advocates for products and services who are more trustable from the eyes of the consumer than the advertiser just putting out advertising. Because of that, I thought advertising would somehow decline, right? Okay, more of it would go online. You don't get billboards anymore, and you get banner adverts on ad. But that seemed to be so exhausted, and there's so much evidence that no one clicks on this stuff already a long time ago, 10, 15 years ago. And I was like, well, this eventually will kind of die out because, as everybody realizes it's an arms race and there's no winners in advertising, there'll be less of it. And now the internet's just completely unusable. You open up a page and you have to click about 5-6 times as if you're getting through the jungle, with a machete, hacking at these advertising to get at the content and then it's unfortunate to call it content, but there we go. That's the kind of stupid reduction that we're living with. But, what is the new form of control that is beyond advertising? So Varoufakis calls it, he understands cloud capital as something distinct. So capital traditionally is a produced means of production, right? A factory. And it's a social relation that affords its owners extractive power over non-owners. Okay, so far so good. That's fairly classical Marxism. There's no dispute there for me. But then he goes, cloud capital also is a produced means of behavioral modification and individuated command. And this is reproduced by our participation in the system, our willingness or acceptance or toleration or having no other choice but to allow them to mine and harvest our data from us, which in turn serves to increase their control over us. And this is no doubt happening, though I guess the question is how influential and how much does it shape the way we understand the world and limit our freedom? I'm not sure. I think in certain regards it's quite serious. In other regards, less so. You know, if there's something implemented like China's social credit system, that's terrifying, right? But if it's them just using our clicks online to sell us stuff, well, you know, that's easily ignorable. It's just obnoxious. That's all. So
I maybe just a quick follow on there, because I know that you're quite right. There were two. My question was, I guess, how do they see power operating today? And I think you're right. I threw two kind of aspects of that at you. The one is the algorithmic behavior modification, and the other is then this question of these fiefdoms and sort of private powers governing territories, whatever. But just to stay on the algorithmic behavior modification, I think one element that connects very strongly with, and it's downstream, I suppose, from the arrival of the algorithm, right? And people have been talking about this for a long time. You know, this is not a new conversation by any means. But I think maybe post 2008, or certainly post 2016, and your podcast has been kind of talking about this topic, I think, for several years now. The end of history and the question of post politics and anti politics. One of the themes I'm picking up here is this accompanying trend, and again, I think it's at least partially downstream from the algorithmic behavior modification techno apparatus that's emerging. It is desocialization or social fragmentation. And I know you're a little cautious of how that gets incorporated into the argument, because you're suggesting, I think, that what looks like neo-feudal social regression ought really more properly to be thought of as the triumph of instrumental rationality. You even used the phrase the death of God, echoing Nietzsche at one stage. And I guess I was really struck by that element of your argument. I think it's clear that what you're trying to say there is that this is not really a break from capitalism, but kind of a deepening of the contradictions of capitalist modernity. But I don't know if that's putting words in your mouth.
No, that's
so
good.
Maybe you could unpack that connection to this desocialization aspect.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question and well put. No problem with putting words in my mouth, because I think that is how I would understand it. So where to start with this? Let me start with crisis of modernity, right? And I think that this is something that I like to emphasize, that we're still in some ways within the horizons and crises and contradictions of modernity. And except that we are in a modernity with no longer any internal or external barriers to capital's dominion. And that's what's new. This is, again, to maybe we'll get onto this maybe in a little bit more depth, but it's why I talk about total capitalism. Capitalism has defeated its internal enemy in terms of socialism and the organized working class. It has overcome states which identified themselves as socialists and acted as a brake on that. It's pursued de-agrarianization almost everywhere throughout the world. Almost everywhere there's been a massive move from countryside to cities. What Miles Davis, wow, what Mike Davis, what Mike Davis already talked about as urbanization without industrialization, already back in his book Planet of Slums, which came out 20 years ago already. All these phenomena mean that capital's rule is kind of everywhere. The idea of subsistence agriculture, tradition, and conservatism, which is rooted in traditionalism, based out in the countryside, that's already been completely eviscerated by capitalism almost everywhere, bar sub-Saharan Africa basically, and even there, to a large extent, has been overcome. So, and in Brazil where I live, it's very clear. Brazil is a huge producer and exporter of beef, soy, corn, etc. Right. But it's 85% urban, right? I mean, Brazil's more urban than some Western European countries. Of course, there's different ways to measure this and so on. But nevertheless, just to give a picture of it, a country which has deindustrialized prematurely, which used to be an industrial power. It's deindustrialized, but the country, it doesn't mean that it's gone back to kind of the reprimarization of the economy hasn't led back to people working in the fields. Agriculture, kind of mega corporate capitalist agriculture doesn't absorb much labor, doesn't need much labor, right? Which is in part of the problem. But anyway, without going too much down that road, the overcoming of internal and external barriers to capitalist dominion, what I call total capitalism, which emerges as of the 1970s, really. But I think we're really understanding its contours only really in the 2010s, means that capitalism is kind of interceding ever deeper into our lives. And this is, again, new, but isn't feudal, I guess, to sum it up, right? So all the different forms of rationalization of social life, where everything is put into question and no longer spared from the eyes of academics who say that something should be some other certain way, or just generally advocates for rethinking every little aspect of life which has been taken for granted. And I'm not making an argument for kind of conservatism in the good old days, but there is something accelerationist to a lot of left liberalism in the social and cultural field, which tries to kind of break down even further any sort of notion of taken for granted areas of social life and submit it to rationalization. Now, what's wrong with that? I mean, I'm in favor of a more rational world, absolutely. But I think there's a difference between that form of instrumental rationality as applied to every area of life and a world ruled by reason, which would be one which wasn't ruled by the market or the decisions of a small set of the ruling class. But these are different things, right? And so the key aspect here, I think, is that rationalization lays the ground for commodification. So even areas which we think, okay, but no one's making a profit, no one's making a buck off of, I don't know, trans ideology, whatever. I'm being a bit facetious here.
I don't know if that's exactly true, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, but the commodification of friendship, right? The way that, for example, dating has been completely rationalized, right? In the sense that there's red flags, preset things which you might decide this makes this person an ideal mate or a bad mate for me, and that you can draw up even spreadsheets and do dating by spreadsheets and keep track of all of that. I mean, it's absurd and inhuman and completely normalized nowadays, and that's a form of rationalization which sets it up for commodification. And indeed, Tinder or whatever is a commodity itself, right? There's actually, interestingly, I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but there's a recent film which I just watched the other day, so it's kind of also fresh in my mind, called Harvest, by a Greek director, Athena Rachel Tsangari. Came out in 2024, and I can't remember any of the names of the actors. I'm terrible with actor names, but basically it takes place in late medieval, early modern Scotland at the time of the enclosures. And I think this is telling, and maybe we can come back to this early capitalism question, because I think it might have something to do with plunder, with primitive accumulation, and so on, which I think the techno-feudalists kind of glimpse but misunderstand. But so they in that film, there's a great example just of, and this is obviously to people who've actually read their Marx, it will be kind of no news here really, but that that it's at the time of the enclosures. There's a medieval village. There's a local lord who's kind of a bit weak but kindly and doesn't really brutalize the peasants very much, other than being the local lord. And then he loses his land to some bigger lord who's much more ambitious and who wants to kind of close off the land and put that land to pasture and kick off the peasants and stop their subsistence production there. what he does is he has this cartographer who comes in and starts mapping the land. And they're a bit skeptical of it. And they don't really realize as the film progresses, and it takes place over 7 days, realize that, he's the bad guy because he's laying the groundwork for enclosure, right? So the mapping of the world, which is for them, they're like, whoa, what is a map? It's like, imagine, these peasants had no conception of two-dimensional space and so on. And maybe it's even, there might be even an element of anachronism, because until there was a separation of physical space and the moral conceptions, took a while, and maybe later than this happened, where space could be represented neutrally and objectively. But in any case, the process of doing that maps out the land and subjects it ultimately to commodity production, right? To put sheep out on the pasture, and it becomes the production of wool, etc., to be sold to the cities and so on. And then the city is now populated by these peasants who have nowhere else to go, etc. Fairly old story, but that's the sort of rationalization which is going on now, and why we should understand that forms of rationalization in line with commodification. The world in which of total instrumental rationality dominates everything, and no one can hold it. It seems difficult to hold to a principle which can justify itself outside of any kind of instrumental calculation. It's a kind of godless world, ours, and I think this is behind a lot of contemporary derangement, because I think there's an ideological aspect to all this techno-feudalism stuff. It's not just about domination, rent, sovereignty, which we haven't come on to yet, but it's also about ideology. And Cédric Durand is very good on this. Again, I think his account is rather convincing on desocialization. So atomization is something that I think a lot of people talk about, right? We're all kind of familiar with this process. But the forms of instrumental rationality, which now kind of seem to dominate all social interactions, have led to a situation where, so in contrast to the kind of 20th century, where there was process of rationalization opposed usually by conservatives, right, not by radicals, was accompanied by at least some sort of humanist and liberal, or humanist and socialist sense, that humanity could somehow take charge of things and run the world in a more rational way. That sense has now gone, that the world might be more humanized. So we have a kind of rationality without any humanism. And so, in a way, the techno-feudal thesis is a story also about not the collapse of capitalism into something else, which I don't think is right, but rather the collapse of liberalism, right? That liberalism no longer exists. And I think I can't recall if I put this in the American Affairs essay or not, but basically de-agrarianization and the conquest of the countryside and it has killed conservatism. Socialism has been defeated, either through victory in the Cold War, through the crushing of the working class through military or political means, and indeed through its own corruption in the form of Stalinism. So that's all gone, and liberalism now is completely in crisis, in the sense that it doesn't defend, free speech, the liberal individual, the kind of individual sovereignty, etc. So all the political traditions of modernity have been corroded or disappeared even, or changed completely, into things that they, conservatism today is really forms of neoconservatism. There is no conservative traditionalism. It's neo-trad, right? And like these things are kind of very different to a kind of slightly complacent defense of the old, right? This is not, the conservatives are advocates in some sense of the new, except using the resources of the old.
I think that's so true. I was talking with someone the other day about like how, 20 years ago, I've been living in the United States 25 years, half my life. Oh. And, back in when I first got here, supplements, vitamins, things like that were all sort of maybe, they weren't so right coded as they are now, like I'd say there were certainly some sense in which some of them were more kind of seen as like hippy dippy, or there was always that sort of like healing crystal kind of community that was advocating supplements or certain kinds of supplements. But today, certainly post-COVID, and I think just listen, as you mentioned, the sort of agrarian, the death of sort of the agrarian bedrock of conservatism, and the defeat of that. There's a certain nostalgia, I think, that comes to mind. I mean, for all his words, the Benjamin Barber's Jihad versus Macworld always kind of makes me think of this kind of tendency. It's not it is a reaction to globalization, to capitalism, but it's also kind of fixating on a past that never really existed, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I'm don't want to take up too much time with that.
That's right. But that but he terms Jihad. I actually recently revisited that book for some other podcast, and I was like, oh, this is actually better than I remembered it.
Yeah,
which is book. But what he terms kind of Jihad, it's kind of revolt against Macworld, I think has various forms, and indeed is coming into might even become hegemonic in certain areas and places. Right. So, I mean, I observe, being in Brazil, evangelical Christianity as one form of some revolt against the modern world or the contemporary world. I don't kind of want to call it modern anymore. I don't know. In which, it's the religion of the world's poor, basically, or at least, the kind of Christian areas. You have fundamentalist Islam in other places. And there's lots of researchers have pointed to the connection between precarity in labor markets, in life as a whole, violence and insecurity, and these fundamentalist forms of religion. And I wrote a thing that came out last year on this, but there's once an adaptation to a world of instrumental rationality and competition, so you can think of the prosperity gospel and so on, basically, if you make lots of money, that's a sign of godliness, etc. And of competition between small pop-up churches everywhere. So there's something very capitalistic, I guess, about evangelical Christianity. At the same time that there's a kind of, a revolt against reason in it. It turns towards forms of magic, speaking in tongues, all this kind of stuff. And so there's something very deeply contradictory, but I think quite evocative of the kind of ideological and intellectual derangement of our times. And that's part of the story of desocialization, I could say more on the ideological aspects, but I'd have to think a little bit.
Well, maybe I'll jump ahead to a question about total capitalism and the periphery and the core and so on, because that was starting to come up in some of what you were just saying, and come back to I had another question about rent. We can come back to that if there's time, but I don't want to be the guy who's obsessed with rent.
We're all obsessed with rent when we have to pay it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Which we all do in one way or another.
Yeah.
So one theme of the article, and it's a fascinating theme, is that so you introduced the theme, the idea of total capitalism in what you were just saying, right? Is that as capitalism becomes total, features that used to be sort of particular, so this is how I understood it, and please correct me if I misunderstood it, but as capitalism becomes total, becomes sort of universal and takes over everything everywhere, features that used to be sort of particular to the imperial periphery, as it's called, start to show up more and more in the core, right? And you use the word peripheralization. And I think that's a fascinating, theme. I'm wondering whether at this point, still, though, it might be that and this is just an open-ended question. It's not that I have a view, but the phenomena that the techno-feudalists are emphasizing to try and make their case, which, and I agree with you, we should resist their conclusion, but also I agree with you that the phenomena they're pointing at are important to think about, right? So the phenomena that they're pointing at, do they show up differently in the periphery than in the core at this point? Is there, so one way of putting this would be, does techno-feudalism look different from Nairobi or Jakarta or Sao Paulo than it does from, New York?
No, I mean, I think in many regards, it is more sharply expressed in the periphery. In fact, that is kind of peripherization. And there's lots of Brazilian theorists who, and indeed urbanists and sociologists and so on, who kind of work with this term. So I'm kind of in some way in debt to their work. Indeed, Paulo Arantes, the kind of brilliant Brazilian critical theorist, has wrote what was the best Brazilian essay on kind of the world becoming Brazilian already back in 2004, but the emphasis was maybe slightly different to what I came to write some 15 years later on that theme. There was more emphasis on a kind of confluence of postmodern fluidity and whatever with Brazilian ways of living and so on. But anyway, the basic point is that as you put it rightly, the features of life in the global periphery are becoming increasingly central to the core. And we can think of the ways, and here I'm going to touch on themes which are central to the techno-feudal thesis, but of course understood, at a kind of structural, systematic level as something different, right? And so the undoing of sovereignty, or the parcelization of sovereignty, as Jodi Dean calls it, is very visible in something like Mexican cartels holding large sections of territory, and in not just that, because that's kind of the more obvious sense, but massively holding assets which have massive financial implications. There was just a big bust last week or 2 weeks ago here in Brazil, where PCC, Primeiro Comando do Capital, which is a originally São Paulo-based prison gang, but which is now the most powerful organized crime syndicate in South America, which has has effects in, has its fingers in, Peru, Bolivia, etc. Controls the drug routes, but that money has to go somewhere, and it's being washed through a bunch of through petrol stations and various other kind of forms of of economic activity. But it turns out that assets held by loads of big banks, financial institutions, is PCC money. So this is a big bust, because Faria Lima, which is basically like São Paulo's Wall Street, and it's the biggest financial center in South America, is all kind of effectively drug money, right? So that is one very significant way in which sovereignty is put into question, centralized state sovereignty, right. And even where there's a fusion between the kind of whatever the ruling class and criminal groups and so on. So that's one form of the peripherization, which I think is increasingly present in core countries. And it's not just it wouldn't be really a story about just the weakness of the state, because at the same time the state's infrastructural powers, at least particularly when it comes to forms of control, only increase, right? Forms of surveillance everywhere, whether cameras and the capturing of data and gate analysis and all the other different forms of ways that it's frightening to think of a revolutionary scenario and whether that would be possible, because the means at the state's disposal to identify people and to lock them up or beat them up or eliminate them is enormous, right? And so it's not a question of the weakness of the state, but rather a kind of reorientation of the state. And I think what fundamentally is at issue here is a weakness of capital and its fusion with the state. And in this regard, the techno-feudalists are right in identifying that aspect. Now, what does that have to do with peripherization? Well, it's precisely on the global periphery where capital has often been unable to stand on its own 2 feet and has needed the state, right, to, for example, pursue forms of primitive accumulation, to take people accumulation by dispossession, kick people off the land, for example, or in the neoliberal period, privatizing assets, whether state-owned companies or public services, and subjecting them to profit making. Basically the state, through all these means, seemingly fair and certainly foul, giving capital a hand when it's unable to generate kind of profit, enough surplus value on its own through just regular market competition. This has been the reality through a lot of phases of capitalism, right? Both the both the kind of weakness of capitalism, which I've just relative weakness of capital and dependence on the state, but also its kind of monopolization has also been a facet of capitalist life in many different places, many different times. And indeed, I after writing the technofeudalism critique, I came across an article which I wish I had come across sooner, which is Emmanuel Wallerstein's reading of Brodel, where he talks about the way that Brodel kind of flipped things around. So rather than the classical liberal and Marxist understanding that capitalism is above all about a free competitive market, Brodel emphasized that, capitalism, there's a level of economic life which is, competitive and market based, but that's for, in a way, the little people, and indeed in labor markets. The big boys, the elephants, exist. The world of capitalism proper is anti-market, what he called contre-marché, right? And so capitalism isn't really about kind of specialization and different companies. No, it's just about the pursuit of profit anywhere and everywhere, right? And it's increasingly done through monopolistic means. And so I think that is a useful understanding, which runs against maybe some, again, classical precepts, but which understands capitalism as inherently monopolistic and anti-market. And indeed, I think I even quote Peter Thiel in the article, who says, competition is for losers. And indeed, competition is for losers. It's for losers in the labor market. You compete against each other, or maybe small petty producers. You compete and have to sell up to Amazon, right? Or sell on Amazon Marketplace, which is why, incidentally, Varoufakis says, enter Amazon.com and you leave capitalism. No, that is capitalism. That's always been capitalism. In fact, it's partly a generalization or attempt to kind of normalize specific experiences of either of early capitalism, of kind of, or maybe 19th century competitive capitalism, or indeed of a kind of the orderly capitalism of mid-20th century, in each of their different ways of saying, look, the kind of organized capitalism of the of the core countries, particularly Western Europe, that experience is what capitalism is, and therefore things which deviate from that are seen as somehow, now it's leading to feudalism or whatever, right? It's like, well, no, that was the exceptional period, right? The second half of the 20th century was really exceptional, and the further we may move away from it, the more that becomes clear. And perhaps the boomers dying out will make this even clearer, because they're the kind of maybe repositories of memory of what that world was, and the treatment of that world as the norm. And it's important to remember the boomers were the generation that were born into that post-war period of affluence, of an organized, orderly capitalism, of liberalism. Perhaps it wasn't 19th century liberalism anymore, but nevertheless, there were some kind of I guess core liberal elements, and indeed of fast growth, healthy profits, and not so much capitalist dependence on the state. And that's what's being left behind. So my argument, and I think I don't even know if I put this in the article, it was more kind of reflecting on it more recently, but this is a general point. What we're faced with is the breakdown of the 20th century, both in terms of the content of the institutions of the 20th century and the forms of them increasingly, right? So if we think about trade unions or political parties or left and right or anti-fascism as a cohering myth for nation states in the West, whatever, we can take all sorts of different, or work, and it's a kind of as a career and a profession which you have your whole life. All these kind of first they were hollowed out, right? And they political parties no longer have members. They become increasingly cartelized, and then even informed, they start to disappear. So the old parties, old traditional socialist parties almost disappear, albeit in France it kind of has made a return. But anyway, all the old forms of work breaking down. So it's 20th century modernity which is breaking down. Perhaps even classical modernity taken as the 19th and 20th centuries, which is framed by the 1789 and the French Revolution and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, maybe that's what's falling apart as well on a larger scale, which would be testified to by the corrosion and a collapse of liberalism. Liberalism being the kind of unifying political thread to that whole long period. And that's what we're faced with. But I don't think it's the end of modernity. Indeed, there was a modernity which predated this. There was a modernity of 1500 to 1800. And there was a capitalism which predated democracy as well. And so to return to a point which I was referring to earlier with like, primitive accumulation cinema,
Right.
or these films about, because there's another one which I watched recently, which is very good, actually, The Promised Land. It's a Danish film with Mads Mikkelsen in the lead, where he's this impoverished Danish officer and he goes off to colonize Jutland, which is, unable to produce agricultural goods, but he's brought back secret potatoes, which, this was a big innovation at the time. Potatoes which were able to grow in that soil and able to provide. So anyway, it's an argument in favor of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism works because he does it against the feudal lords who want to retain dominion over their lands. And he goes, no, I'm going to make this thing grow and bring it under the dominion of the king. And so it's the kind of centralization. It furthers the advance of the state, etc. So whatever, a story about early capitalism. I don't know. Maybe there's a trend. Maybe there isn't, cinematically anyway. But the point is, the point about all this is that what the techno-feudalists misunderstand and portray as being a kind of return to feudalism. We can go into why it has nothing to do with feudalism. There's any number of ways in which it that's just the wrong analogy, and we can get into also why that idea appeals, why this feudal metaphor seems kind of right, but it's completely wrong. But really, we're seeing the end of democratic capitalism, right? So the features that we have today are more akin to pre-democratic capitalism, which is fitting because what ours is now is post-democratic capitalism. Colin Crouch's term post-democracy is a situation in which the formal institutions of democracy still exist, but have been hollowed out, corroded, and so on. I think things have advanced even further, unfortunately, beyond what Colin Crouch wrote. This was already maybe 15 years ago or something. But effectively, I think the techno-feudal theorists misunderstand post-democratic capitalism for being feudal, when it really looks a lot more like, in some ways, early capitalism or pre-democratic capitalism at any rate.
It's fascinating. So
I just
Martin,
point out that I just wanted to point out there that you you happened to hit upon Class Unity's motto there: settler colonialism works. That's actually our. So thanks for working that in. We didn't pay him to do that, I promise.
But so if the liberal project as maybe an ideological political project that emerged within the history of capitalism has kind of failed to contain the contradictions of first industrial capitalism and now whatever sort of more high-tech version or post-material capitalism or something like this that we're talking about today. Global peripheralization, if you want to use that terminology, maybe with all the tensions inherent in those two terms, it seems pretty clear that the future looks bleak for the liberal subject. And I thought one of the more interesting kind of aspects of your article was indeed towards the end, where you're citing Zizek and Dean and Varoufakis as they all kind of try to stumble around for solutions to all of this, for strategies. It seems that they still have some hope for resuscitating the liberal subject, but as you note yourself, the tools for immanent critique, which is what the liberal critique of capitalism, I think, and even maybe the Marxist critique of capitalism depend on, are just harder to access than they were before. So this leads us to the question of then what we propose. I think I see you saying that ideological struggle may be exhausted, and that something more like a pocketbook strategy, or sort of, I'm thinking James Carville here. It's the economy, stupid. But I'm also thinking here, I don't know how you feel about this text. I think I kind of like it, but Aaron Bastani's Fully Automated Luxury Communism, I think you've had him on your show. Just sort of ways, or even the kind of the new abundance project that's kind of being articulated by some liberals. But it's all sort of taking us back to this kind of question of like economy first, right? Or something that even sort of sounds like a cipher of class first politics, perhaps. But certainly not like ideological struggle anymore, right? So you don't exactly mention this, but I think these literatures, but they're in orbit of what you're talking about, the techno-feudal discourse. And I'm just wondering, is there something to be gained from that kind of line of thinking, a return to material politics, or does that still miss the need? Because I think certainly towards the end, and I know you've had Wolfgang Streeck on recently. We recently had our own interview with him on class unity. In his recent work, he's talking about the need to commandeer the state, and maybe those literatures that I just mentioned don't quite do the job of taking on that topic as much as we might need to if we're going to take this challenge seriously. So a broad question there, I appreciate, but it's kind of the where do we go from here argument or question.
Yeah. I mean, what do you mean by, the distinction you draw between materialist or material politics and an ideological politics?
Well, I think what I see going on in the abundance literature and in Bastani's book and in that kind of sort of vernacular sense of like, it's the economy stupid by James Carville is this idea that people aren't really going to sort of ever form an ideological, the mass rank and file of workers or ordinary citizens aren't really going to join an ideological struggle in this time where, as you rightly say, the tools of immanent critique seem to be kind of dormant. So the idea, I think, would be, and I think Aaron Bastani does this very well, actually, despite my criticisms of that text, he does sort of talk about the need for us to rethink socialism as a political project. And so sort of returning to kind of sewer socialist kind of strategies. Mamdani in New York would be an interesting thing to think about as a more contemporary example of that. Sort of returning to bread and butter issues and sort of showing people that, hey, if you vote for me, I'll make this work for you. I'll make it work better, right? I can give you solutions that are going to make your life easier, whether it's putting in affordable grocery stores, this kind of thing. It sounds almost like childish or maybe naive or innocent in terms of its lack of scalar ambition, right? It's modest. It's starting off sort of molecularly, but in terms of like that kind of slow motion progress of I think, in the literature, sometimes this notion of non-reformist reforms kind of comes up, that you kind of want to keep hitting those material wins until you kind of reach a critical mass. And then you can kind of advance a project of something more like commandeering the state. Have I clarified?
I think that's useful. But I guess it spirals off into various different directions, right? Because there's people who, friends and colleagues who would be in favor of something much more directly political, like not a social politics, not a material politics, but really one focused on democracy and kind of democratizing the state. So there's that. There's those who focus, just small bread and butter issues, but with a tendency to be a little bit welfarist for my taste, I think. And we also have to deal with the reality of a collapse of trust. So, if you're selling something, people aren't really going to believe in you either. Anyway, but I don't want to kind of talk just politics in general, because I'm going to lose myself in that. But I want to return to the kind of what is suggested by the techno-feudal theorists, or perhaps even against their intentions, but at least in my reading of it. And I think there's two directions. One, as you mentioned already, like an immanent critique, or I think I should cite Zizek in saying, originally, critiques of a kind of total social order emerge as a form of actually fealty to or over-identification with what they promise. So that is to say heresy, not apostasy. So it's not being anti-capitalist, but being the truest capitalist you can possibly be. Capitalists here, not in the Brodelian sense as being, the big elephants, monopolies and so on, but a world of more specialization, of each little petty producer selling in a dynamic competitive market in which profits are near zero, right? I mean, this is what a really competitive market is. And there are, I think, elements of that in the techno-feudal critics. There's elements to that in Cory Doctorow's critiques of tech monopoly capital, which is to advocate in favor of competition, effectively of liberal capitalism as against what we have today. And it's interesting insofar as it tries to use resources and at least some of the discourse that's still more or less around today against capitalism. And of course, if you demanded and somehow enacted policies for genuine competition and subjected commodity producers to genuine competition, to the degree of brutal competition that labor markets that you have in labor markets, it would probably bring a lot of the whole edifice down, right? Because capitalist monopolization is a response to its own weakness. And if you actually broke up monopolies and subjected them to more competition, it would be very problematic for them. And, even just withdraw state support. And so this is a kind of petty bourgeois anti-capitalist politics in the name of capitalism. And perhaps there's something to that. I'm not entirely convinced, but I think it's interesting. This is why I kind of point to perhaps the limits of an imminent critique, because as state capitalism becomes the dominant form, and we leave neoliberalism, which, worth remembering, at least made notional reference and had a notional adherence to liberalism, to competition, even if in practice it pointed in the opposite direction. It was more state, more monopoly. As we move out of that into state capitalism, there's not even the discourse of competition anymore, because, nobody wants that. That competition is for the little guy in labor markets, right? It's you struggling to find a job, competition for work, not competition for a larger share of the pie. And that's fine from the point of view of the capitalists, right? They don't want more competition between themselves. Anyway, so there's that kind of populist road, and populist here understood in as a kind of populism 1.0, the populism of producers, right? Of referring to the 1890s, the original populists in the US and in Russia, the Narodniks. That's kind of one avenue suggested by this, and it's worth hearing out. It's never been my politics really, so I'm maybe a little bit uncomfortable with it, but I'm curious to see how that could play out, right? To kind of go, okay, we'll call your bluff. Yeah, let's have competition, right? The other one is to reckon with the aspect of contemporary capitalism, which most runs against any notion of feudalism, and why any talk of feudalism is completely bunk, is increased socialization of production, the concentration and centralization of capital. If the state already kind of underpins, guarantees, provides for kind of private capital activity and profit making, it does make the possibility of what Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozvorsky talked about as the People's Republic of Walmart, right? That you already have a high degree of economic planning, which happens within corporations, spanning massive value and supply chains all around the world. That already is economic planning. So if you were able to bring that under democratic control, which this sounds much more traditionally like socialism than the kind of liberalism that I was talking about, then you have a much more direct access to the commanding heights of the economy through democratic political power in a way that perhaps was not possible in the past. Because yes, you could take power of the state, but there'd be loads of private capitals with a lot of tacitly a lot of power at their disposal, which which now is not the case, because it's all so dependent and intermeshed with the state. So anyway, these things kind of point, I think, in two different directions. Neither of them is directly, I think, a politics in the way that you were talking about. It certainly isn't something which seems directly amenable to any like electoral platform or something like that.
Interesting.
Which is why I was trying to, but there's something. It's something certainly it would be prior to that, right? Yeah. But anyway, just to restate what these avenues are is it's competition, it's liberal capitalism against monopoly capitalism, which wouldn't lead, because liberal capitalism is an impossibility today, it would lead to a much more serious kind of reckoning, and which might be able to draw on the resources and militancy of the small middle class, of the petty bourgeoisie, not just of the working class. And the second one is a more traditionally socialist one, which kind of follows capital along the line of going, well, okay, it's all brought together, state and capital all together. Let's just take it over and subject it to democratic control. But that the agency for that is currently not visible. But I think just to make one last political point, I think a useful way to think about populism today, I mean, I'm always reluctant to use the word just because it means a million different things to everybody, but populism is the kind of necessary politics of our time, like it or not. And what Perry Anderson describes in his Regime Change in the West, kind of this recent essay, came out I think at the beginning of the year, is that, you have three pillars, and the populists have never been able to, and this is left populists and right populists, have never been able to attack all three at once. And the three pillars are, on the one hand, inequality, effectively. The second one being oligarchic politics. And the third one being factor mobility, which includes questions around migration, which are, spiky, I guess, or, a difficult thing to deal with on the left. And so Perry Anderson, I think, his basic point there is correct, in my view, that basically the left populists have been able to talk about inequality and oligarchic politics, but not factor mobility. And the right has been able to talk about factor mobility, or certain aspects of it, particularly migration and oligarchic politics, but not inequality. And really, you'd have to unite these three. And in a way, a lot of populist upsurges have been either captured by left or right and has, as a consequence, diffused them, or they've been refused to be captured by institutional political forces of left and right, and as a consequence relied purely on street energy, which eventually dissipates, which would be the story of the Gilets jaunes, for example, in France. And so, the question is, can the next, because there will be at some point another popular upsurge on the streets in some way. These things come in waves, and the last one was in the early 2010s. So, maybe we're due another one. Things will erupt in some form or another. And the question is whether these kind of populist demands can be unified, and probably under a new form of organization, or new, something which is not, to use kind of dumb American terms to go around now, but left coded nor right coded, right? Of course, yeah. To being truer to its populist pretense of being kind of not neither left or right, somehow non-ideological, merely speaking for the people. Well, okay, if we're playing, if we're going to kind of play on the terrain that's presented to us, the kind of social terrain that's presented to us, maybe we have to kind of go with that. And that might involve some element of democratization and kind of along the second line of what I was talking about, as well as the first line of kind of demanding breakup of monopolies and so on, which won't happen, right? But might be a wedge. I don't know. This is really speculative. I should stop talking at this point.
So there's I just happened to, whilst reading your article and thinking about these things, I also happened to cross a quote from Michael Heinrich from his biography of Marx, and I'll sort of shorten it, but it starts out this way. Nowadays, in Europe or the United States, every 10 or 20 years, a new age is proclaimed. Age is in quotes. In the late 1990s, it was the internet age, and then he skips through a bunch of examples, right? He talks about the internet age, the computer age, the service economy has been rediscovered a number of times, as he puts it, consumer society. He traces this back as far as the 60s at one point. And then he says, labeling new technological or economic changes with a new age name connects with people's everyday experiences and brings media attention. However, a few years later, it becomes clear that the new era hasn't really come that far. In light of crisis, unemployment, and precarious employment, the all too pretty constructions of a post-materialist and post-capitalist era have lost much of their earlier plausibility. So, although he doesn't put the biggest emphasis on it, he is claiming there's a sort of pattern of people every so often saying, "Oh, we're moving out of capitalism now because of this big new age."
Yeah.
And it could be this or this or this, and so maybe this is just inviting you to sort of psychologize a little bit, but it wouldn't necessarily be that. So the question is, do you think that the turn to techno-feudalism, for those who've been turning to it, would count as an instance of this pattern, if indeed there is such a pattern? And then if it is, what's driving that urge? If there is sort of one single thing, is it sort of lack of clarity about the nature of capitalism? Is it political despair? Is it just to be cynical? Is it just a desire to have something new to say or to sell books?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question, and I haven't read Heinrich Marx's biography though. That's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. I guess I don't take techno-feudalism seriously, but on the other hand, unlike the kind of sunny optimism about post-industrial society, it's so doomly techno-feudalism that I'm tempted to treat it a little bit more seriously, because those happy things where capitalism resolves its own contradictions and we move to a higher plane where we're all service workers and there's no more class. Basically, Tony Blair, right? Like Tony Blair gave most clear, out of any politician, the clearest expression, political expression to that sort of idea, and it's bullshit. So, absolutely should be kind of dismissive of that. I think the feudalism thing, where it appeal, I was trying to kind of think about, why does it have a certain appeal, a certain, not just sexiness, because that seems to be mediatic, and I think that's the negative side of it, right? Everybody wants to create a new term. Everybody just not only claim that, create a new concept, but be the first to glimpse and announce the new mode of production, right? And anyone following kind of in Marx's footsteps, whether nominally or practically or whatever, also wants to be able to do that, right? And so there's a pattern there. I'm reluctant. I mean, we could maybe accuse me of doing the same thing with the end of history, but that's kind of, I'm precisely not saying that it's kind of new as the collapse of what had been previously installed. So why does the feudal imagery appeal? Well, it speaks to our lack of leverage or lack of power, the sense of huge gaping inequality and of domination, right? We're all these little serfs going around, and that there's these big masters of the universe kind of controlling our every move. We enter these platforms, which are like the new terrain. It seems like instead of the market where we sell stuff, we're on these marketplaces, which are really actually platforms and so on. I mean, that's the kind of experience of many people. And therefore, I guess that's why the feudal metaphor speaks to us. And, you have the great Matt Borst, the cartoonist, where there's this frame which has gone completely viral over the last, 10 years or I don't know how long. Yeah, no, it just recently celebrated 10 years of this meme, for the meme historians out there, of the peasants carrying this bale of hay going, we should improve society somewhat. And then this smart aleck pops up out of a well going, and yet you participate in society, right? Which in fact, someone has used that meme to criticize me and my critique of techno-feudalism, because I'm being a smart ass saying, well, actually, these forms of rent are actually just profiteering and blah, 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 as if to characterize me as saying there's nothing new going on. And the techno-feudalists are right because they're saying something new is going on. I'm like, no, there's also new stuff going on. It's just that it's not feudal. And that's a stupid way of understanding it. The reason why feudalism also has an appeal is because there's a long tradition on the left, a wrong one, of denouncing injustice. Now, that might sound provocative to listeners, but the basic... But this is what Marx argued against, that capitalism is fundamentally fair. You're paid fairly for your day's labor. Not always, and there's exceptions to this. And I think our understanding of really existing capitalism should be broader than the kind of narrow one presented by classical political economy and then Marx in his critique of it, to understand the role of monopoly in a lot of places, the role of of plunder and so on, all these features which we can resume under peripherization today, which have always been present in capitalism. It's just that they've often not been present in the most advanced countries, and now they are, and that's what's new, right? But what appeals about the kind of feudalism notion is this idea that something unjust is happening, right? That there's an unequal exchange. So unlike Marx's description of capitalism, which is based fundamentally on equal exchange, but of course the extraction of surplus value and exploitation, that there's expropriation going on. They're stealing something which is kind of extra legal, or even if legally smoothed over, is happening outside of the way the market should work. And that's what it provides its appeal. And I mean, I think Morozov was already onto this in his critique, noting that what holds its appeal is this kind of visceral ability to go, aha, this is unfair, this is unjust by capitalism's own rules, and therefore this should be opposed. But of course, what's the problem with that is that all denunciation is pays homage to the rules themselves, right? And so to say this is unfair is to say, well, let's go back to real capitalism. Let's go back to the good old-fashioned capitalism, good old-fashioned exploitation. None of this terrible expropriation stuff, right? And I think that's really problematic. And I think that's a little bit different, just to be clear, unless people are kind of going, well, but weren't you talking about this idea of holding up genuine liberal capitalism competition as a way of challenging monopolies and so on? Yes, but that's very self-consciously aware of the fact that it's impossible, right? But maybe a means of kind of tearing this whole thing open. But it's a wedge. It's not a genuine proposition that we might return to mid-20th century, let alone 19th century capitalism. That's an impossibility. So that's, I think, what the appeal of technofeudalism. It's a mediatic plaything, as I call it. There's this, it has to do with selling books and creating the new concept and being sexy and whatever. It also speaks to people, I think, in some intuitive sense, and also has this element of denunciation to it, which of a moralistic denunciation, which provides, which is always a tendency on the left, and always, I think, has to be combated. This has always been theoretically, the proposition of Marxism against the left as it exists as a kind of spontaneous complaint against capitalism and the way things are.
Can I just jump in and say I that's great. I completely agree, and I just wanted to, as it were, recommend to the potential reader, if you're listening to this and you haven't read this article, it's a great article. Throughout, one of my favorite bits is the part where you talk about this issue, and you bring in Matt Huber, for example, right, and talk about that a problem with focusing so much on rent in the kind of way that some of these thinkers do is that you end up making it sound like we got to get rid of the bad guys who are the rentiers, and then we'll be much better off if we're with the good old capitalists who are at least doing something productive and blah blah blah. And that's I just really like that part of the article. So
and perhaps I should have put it more sharply. It's a facet of capitalism's weakness, of capital's weakness today, that it needs to lean on these forms of expropriation, of plunder, of rent seeking, etc., in various different ways, or simply just dependence on the state, for subsidies, for market making, for etc. That's again not unprecedented in the history of capitalism. In fact, it's been, as I say, very present. But this is why you need to look to the sides, not back. Right, to look to understand our world, look to the peripheries of capitalism throughout their history more than it means looking back to a European pre-capitalist past or i.e. feudalism.
I'll let you in on a little. Martin won't mind. I think we've been doing a lot of pre-gaming for this, and one of the things we were really getting into is like, well, is he saying the periphery is now everywhere? or the periphery has been global? Like, so has the core been peripheralized as the periphery being cored? I'm like, I think it's both. So at the end of the day, maybe you can help us help clarify that for us.
Yeah, well, I need to work a little bit more on. I mean, there's, as I say, it's not my like original idea or something. There's lots of theorists in Brazil who've kind of been working on this notion, and there is a, I think maybe not the periphery. I mean, I don't mean like Kenya, but kind of the bigger semi-peripheral countries, whether it's Brazil or Mexico or Turkey or maybe Thailand and places like this, give you probably a better glimpse of where we're going and how to understand the world now than in the past, where there was a clear temporality of, well, you have the advanced countries and they're more advanced, and that's where all the production is happening. I mean, production also in terms of ideas and understandings and whatever, and most things are kind of downstream from that. I mean, you might have these elements of third worldism and so on, but there's always an element of kind of catch up, right? And so if the periphery is behind now, it's just because it's behind. It's all in the same course, right? And it'll eventually catch up. And now we exist in a kind of different order of time where the temporalities have changed. It's not like you have, Britain up ahead and then Brazil behind to, mention the two countries which I'm most familiar with, but like they kind of exist within the same time. Brazil's stationed at its level of development. Britain is at its own and is kind of going backwards. And so it's a different world to the 20th century where we kind of understood these things as existing along the same line, like modernization theory presumed, like that's what's different. And so I think I was reading an article today about France's governmental chaos. I was like, wow, this is unprecedented. Right. And it's a little bit like, so even at the kind of political institutional level, it's like, this is chaos. I'm like, this is just like an ordinary day in Brazilian Congress. Like, so maybe it inures you a little bit to being too much like, whoa, what's going on? And being like, okay, but this is just the kind of capitalism, like red in tooth and claw that has always been the feature of life on the periphery. As it becomes more present in kind of core countries, you're kind of like, yeah, okay, but I don't know, maybe you're less surprised by it or something if you live on the periphery. I don't know.
Well, thanks, Alex. That was a really great discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing where you go with this. For listeners who have found this article interesting and who want to check your work a little bit more, obviously there's the Bunga podcast, but is there anything you're kind of working on right now or that's coming out for you soon that you might want people to check out before we say goodbye today?
Nothing which will be out that soon, because I'm kind of working on a book on.
Oh, wonderful!
Some of these ideas that we're talking about here, in providing a look at the B side of the West, to see our future.
Okay.
That's a longer term thing. But on BungaCast, I've got lots of interesting things coming up. A series on the future of place, a look at 20th century soft Bonapartists like de Gaulle and Nasser and Vargas and Perón as a way of understanding our moment, or how our moment might differ from that one. Quite excited about those projects, but I guess mainly on BungaCast.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much on behalf of Martin and myself.
No, thank you for the questions.
This was really, really great. Yeah. I think this is a topic that will stay very much at the center of mind for many members of Class Unity moving forward. So hopefully we can get you back on again when that new book may be available.
Fantastic. Absolutely.
All right, brilliant.
Yeah, thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Alex.
Thank you.